Yep. Okay. Okay, we're going to be starting our edition now. So, good afternoon and welcome to this month's BètaBreak edition. To introduce our initiative, BètaBreak, for those of you who are new, BètaBreak is a student-led committee here at the UvA whose main aim is to make science accessible to everyone. We host monthly panel discussions about different science-related topics and invite experts in different fields for students to get the opportunity to discuss exciting new topics in the sciences, and in this case, science adjacent.
Yeah, so today our perspective and the conversation is gonna be mostly about like a critical approach to sciences and the humanities, so trying to understand how these fields relate to each other, how they're perceived in society, in academia, and even how they differ in the way they kind of try to tackle knowledge, truth, and also how they relate to society and also trying to understand whether it's possible to have such thing as the reunification of knowledge and where they actually see a divide happening. Yeah.
So we're going to start off by introducing our speakers. We'll start at the end here with Dr. Kiverstein. Here's a professor at the UvA in neurophilosophy, and if you came to our complex consciousness symposium in October, you might remember him from that. And then here we have Dr. Woudenber, who is actually from the VU, Humanities department, where he's part of the CLU Plus Research Institute. And then here we have Dr. Keestra, who is part of the UvA Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, and he's also the Central Diversity Officer of the UvA. So we'll let them give a proper introduction of themselves. So, do you want to start?
Yeah, so let me use this so you can hear me.
This one works.
Yeah, great. So, hello everyone. Thanks for having me back again. So I am trained as a philosopher, but I work in the psychiatry department now with Damian Denise as part of what was called the Lemon Tree Center for Psychiatry, Psychotherapy, and Philosophy. And my approach has always been to work at the interface between philosophy and the sciences, cognitive science, neuroscience. So I had this position as a neurophilosopher in the past, and now I'm in psychiatry, so working between medicine and philosophy around issues to do with mental health. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion today. I'm against this epistemological divide between science and the humanities, so I'll be exploring some of my reasons for being skeptical about that divide.
So my name is René van Woudenberg. I'm a professor of philosophy and I specialize in epistemology and metaphysics. So epistemology is that field of philosophy that thinks about knowledge, belief, truth, justification, evidence, and how these things relate. And one of my interests among others, is well, how should we think about the humanities? Do they give us knowledge? What are the epistemic offerings they have provided so far, and how do they relate to the sciences? So, do the sciences give us knowledge? And for quite a bit of time, I've been thinking about a claim usually called scientism, which is the idea that there is only one sort of knowledge that we have. There's one serious source of knowledge there is, and that's the natural sciences. And I've been a bit critical of that. And finally, a final thing is that I've been interested in also how do scientific claims and scholarly claims relate to moral and religious claims. Are they worlds apart, or are there interconnections between these things? So that's it for the moment.
Hi everyone, my name is Keestra, and being a philosopher here at UvA, my PhD was also on the interconnection of philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and hermeneutics, so the theory and practice of understanding human actions, for instance. And I'm part of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, which is here on the 3rd floor. And a few of our programs, or bachelor programs in natural and social sciences, beta, gamma, and future planet studies, bring together different disciplines, mainly like the life, natural sciences, and the social sciences and behavioral sciences. Because many of the problems that we are looking at nowadays, problem of climate change, migration, financial crisis, etc., are really on the interstitials of these two, let's say, two different perspectives. We are making maybe mathematical models of climate change. We're trying to develop policies, so we have to consult political scientists and theorists, maybe psychologists, sociologists, like what measures, what interventions might work, what will people actually do to help us mitigate climate change, global warming. So this interconnection between the different domains, large domains of social sciences, life sciences, hard sciences, is really my bread and butter. And acting now as a central diversity officer, I'm also trying to bring that same lens. So we need really to accept that many of the issues that we're dealing with, also at an institution like the university, have many different factors. There are economic factors, there are political factors. Students do also bring their own expectations and attitudes, and how can we develop measures and activities that together bring out the most desirable outcome. So I think maybe that all three of us believe that we have to build bridges across the epistemological divide, so maybe we can get some more fire or pushback from questions or comments from you.
Okay, awesome. So thank you very much. And of course, we're gonna welcome anything you would like to share. We have prepared for that 3 moments for questions at the end of each section. So feel free to take a mental note of whatever you think is relevant or interesting. And we're also gonna start with some questions, like quotations that we actually found from some literature, so that we maybe use that as a starting point for any kind of reflections. So the first one is from an article by Anne Thrasher. The division between art and sciences is embedded in our culture. We think of science as exact, objective, following a strict method, whereas art as creative and subjective, with no formal rules. But this picture misunderstands what actual science looks like. In practice, science is not about following a strict algorithm-like method, but like in arts, making judgment calls and thinking creatively.
So from this point, I would like to address to Dr. Woudenber, maybe trying to understand how did you come to conceive in your practices, in your research, the distinctive aims and practices happening in humanities and sciences?
That's a beautiful question, thank you much. So, the philosopher Aristotle said that various disciplines are distinguished from each other by the type of objects that they are studying. Now, here's a thought that that I find interesting, and I think that can be developed to great length. The humanities, and also parts of the social sciences, the objects that they study are, let me give first examples and then give a general characterization of them. So the objects they study is for instance, the Rosetta Stone, an old stone with inscriptions that took quite a bit of effort to decipher what the message on the stone actually was. What we study in the humanities is, well, what was the reason that Napoleon brought his army to Waterloo? We are studying how strategic partners cooperate or fail to cooperate with one another. In the humanities, we study objects that have, we study literary works, we study poems, we study trends within literature. We try to evaluate the quality of certain works of art, of paintings. Within the humanities, and here's the very broad picture. The humanities studies objects, or in the humanities we study objects that have three very cool qualities. They are the products of intentional action, they have meaning, and they embody values. So when we study Napoleon and what he did and why he brought his army to Waterloo, we are studying the intentions. What are his reasons? What are the motives that made him make the decisions that he made? We evaluate the wisdom of his decision. So we are thinking what he did embodies a certain value, and we have to evaluate that value that he assigned to it. And it was in the European history, it was certainly a very meaningful event, the Battle of Waterloo. So the general picture is in the humanities and also in parts of the social sciences, the objects that are being studied are objects that are the result of intentional actions, or they are the intentional actions themselves. They are embodied with meaning, and they embody certain values. Contrast this with the natural sciences. So when my colleagues do high energy physics, there's no theory that they are developing in which the notion of intentionality, value, or meaning has any place. So if you think about along these Aristotelian lines, disciplines are distinct from one another by the objects that they are studying, then you could say, well, the humanities, they study these objects that have these threefold characteristic. But the exact sciences, the natural sciences, surely they have other objects. They have such properties like mass, shape, physical shape, color, attraction. They have totally different sorts of properties. And the theories, therefore, that we find in the natural sciences, they are littered with totally different concepts than the theories that we find in the humanities. So this seems like I'm actually saying they are worlds apart. But they are not totally worlds apart, because all the objects, or most of the objects that are studied in the humanities, they are what we call constituted by physical stuff that can be studied in the sciences. So here is a very down-to-earth example. So take a credit card. Do the natural sciences have anything of any value to say about the credit card? Well, they can say something about the plastic materials and the properties of the plastic materials. But the natural sciences have no handle on the fact that it's a mode of paying and that it's a manner of purchasing things. So the credit cards are a particular sort of object, an object that is constituted by physical stuff. The natural sciences have a very strong handle on the physical stuff, but they don't have a handle on the social function and the value and the meaning of these objects. So that's my initial proposal.
So I think that's a really useful way of setting up the divide potentially between the humanities and the natural sciences based on the objects of study and how those objects are known. What I want to pick up on is that if we take nature to be what is investigated by the natural sciences, this would have the consequence that in the natural world there is no intentionality, there is no meaning, there is no value. So the natural world is a kind of disenchanted universe where meaning, purpose, intentionality have no place. And in my work, I've been interested in how to re-enchant nature, so how to bring back these notions of meaning, value, purpose into the objects that are studied within the natural sciences. I come from disciplines that intersect with biology, so my starting point is with organisms, with living systems, and I'm interested in whether maybe there were some mistakes that were made when we adopted a kind of picture of organisms as machines. Because as soon as you adopt that picture, then it becomes difficult to see how living systems, organisms could be behaving in meaningful ways, how they could be the origin or source of meaning, value, intentionality, and so on. And so I want to push back a little bit on the picture that René presented us, that as soon as we think of science and the humanities as distinguished by their objects of study, I think that results in a picture of nature which Max Weber characterized as a disenchanted picture. And for Weber, he thought, well, science just has to accept that's what it's dealing with. But I want to just question that and ask whether that's right, and whether when we think about things that are essentially human, or things that are tied to life, like meaning, purpose, intentionality, could we actually find a place for those concepts within the natural sciences rather than seeing them as just belonging to the humanities and having no place within what's described by natural science?
Right, maybe I can add my 2 cents as well. So Julian and I coincidentally have been part of a research group on neurocultures and neuroaesthetics, which really brought together people from philosophy, from cognitive neuroscience, but also the humanities, to investigate, for instance, how particularly brain processes are involved in the production of art objects, or vice versa, how artists can make use of instruments from the sciences, AI, computational sciences. And I recall a few interesting questions that we discussed in this research group. One, for instance, many of you may have been to the Van Gogh Museum, the Van Gogh Museum, where particular forms of portraying like trees or the starry night, maybe you recall. And then the question is like, to what extent is Van Gogh reflecting the science of the day, or are perhaps particular brain processes or the observation of how we perceive, how we visually perceive when we are looking at the sun and having these particular, like you're being blinded almost. Maybe Van Gogh tried to reflect that into his painting. And I also recall a very interesting, a colleague from University of Amsterdam, a physicist by training, who worked together with people from the Rembrandt project and the Bruegel project many years ago, trying to develop an AI, a kind of a database, an AI system to help detect what paintings or what sections of paintings of Bruegel are authentic by Bruegel himself and not. So this was a combination of material science, but also art historians who could show like particular brush strokes seem to be really part of Van Breugel's signature. So there's really a combination of hard physics, material sciences, AI, and also art history, and of course, also historical studies of particular paintings, like what is the provenance, the history of the painting. Can we bring all this knowledge together to tell that indeed this particular painting or that particular part of a painting is authentically painted by Bruegel or not? So I think that indeed many also of the products of human creativity, of well, everything that we're building, etc., they do have these different perspectives, or they allow the different perspectives. They're both material and intentional. They carry meaning, and sometimes it's really helpful to bring these perspectives together to get a better grip on these objects.
Okay, thank you so much. This is a great way to start our conversation. So next, I'm going to ask you all a question about truth. So our quote that we're basing this off is from the book The Blind Spot. And they say, living is sense-making in precarious conditions. So I ask all of you, how is truth perceived by each field, either by your field, by fields that you, by fields that you've worked with, come into contact with, all that? And how does it implicitly condition the practices of these fields? Anyone can answer?
Right. So I can't speak for all philosophers because there is some disagreement among philosophers about what truth is or what it amounts to. Now, there was an empirical research about the opinions among philosophers 3 or 4 years back. So from all the top institutions across the world, some 1,200 people were invited. And actually, I myself participated in the review. And one of the questions was truth, correspondence theory, coherence theory, pragmatic theory, and there were a couple of others. What is the most popular theory? Well, much to my surprise, the great majority leaned towards a realist conception of truth. So, truth is a property of a statement or of a theory, and a statement has that theory. And a statement or a theory has that property insofar as the statement or the theory tells it like it is. So, the statement "lemons are sour" has the truth property if and only if lemons are sour. Or the Amsterdam University College is next door is only true if the Amsterdam University College is next door. So, and actually that's also, so I side with the majority of philosophers. It's a very classical conception. It's also the common sense notion of truth. So if you say it like it is, you said something true. As a side remark, I want to say there's a big distinction between saying what it is for a statement to be true, or which conditions must be satisfied for a statement to be true, and the conditions that must be satisfied for us knowing that a statement is true. Those are really distinct conditions. But you know, whether something is true or not, that doesn't depend on whether we believe it, it doesn't depend on whether we know it, it doesn't depend on whether we entertain it. So here is two examples or two thoughts that might make that a bit intelligible. So there is a truth about the number of stars in the universe. Is it odd or even? No one knows whether it's odd or even. But there is a truth about it. We are simply not in the position of knowing which it is. Is the number odd or is it even? And the second thought that might make this somewhat intelligible is, so when we are doing research, medical research, physical research, or for instance, medical research into the causes of a particular disease, we are assuming there is a truth about what actually causes the disease. And now we are trying to figure out through a process of investigation and inquiry what that cause is. The truth is already there. We are now only trying to figure that out. So I have a very classical and objectivist notion of truth. Truth is out there. So here's to set it off from a contrary view. The philosopher Edmund Husserl once said, let's engage in a thought experiment. Suppose through some unfortunate event or other, all human beings vanish from the earth. There are no people anymore. And let's say it also that the higher organisms, of whom you might think that they have thoughts and beliefs as well, they have vanished from the earth as well. Now, says Husserl, ask yourself the following question. Are there in that world, without human beings, are there still truths in that world? If you follow my line of thought, I'd say, yes, there are still truths, but there's no one to know them. But the alternative view is, there is no truth anymore in that world. Because for there to be truths, there must be knowers. So that's not my view, but it is a serious view out there, and it has merited a lot of philosophical discussion. So that's my view about truth.
Well, maybe I can pick up there, because my answer to that question would indeed be very different. If there's no one to make any statements, there will be no truth. It reminds me of this thought experiment by Aristotle, when he says, well, here are two statements. Tomorrow there will be a sea battle. One statement. The other statement being, tomorrow there will not be a statement, not be a sea battle. The question is, are we today able to determine the truth of one of these two statements? If truth is to be somehow attached to a statement, we have to define also the conditions, like when are we then able to determine whether that statement is truth? Well, we have to wait for tomorrow. And tomorrow we have to make an observation. So if there's just a collision between two ships, do we call that a sea battle? No. There has to be more involvement, more blood, more bloodshed, etc., broken sails, etc., before we call it a sea battle. So what we have to do is really offer a definition. When are we agreeing that a sea battle is taking place? We have to rely on witness statements. So yes, I've seen two ships beating up each other, two are sunken, etc. Okay, then we agree, you've seen it, there's enough havoc, so there's a sea battle, etc. So now we're able, in a web of statements, to determine, yes, now one of these statements, we can assign it as truth. So in this particular poll that René referred to, I would much more cling to a coherence theory of truth, so where it's a coherence between different statements, including observation statements, so what can we observe in the world, and are the different witnesses also having coherent statements with each other, not one saying, well, I've seen 10 ships all sunken, and the other says, well, I've not seen any ships, you must be hallucinating. Then we don't know. But maybe, and I'll close with that, just to, in some sense, avoid the technicalities of the discussions about truth, in my philosophy of science classes at our Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, I've always preferred the notion of robustness. What we are out for as scientists, as humanities scholars, is to produce insights that hold up under a variety of conditions. in the lab, maybe outside the lab. So we are repeating experiments. Do we find that these experiments yield the same results? So are the results robust even if we change the conditions, the temperature, the setup of the experiment, or we use different populations? Then we say, well, this is a robust finding. And actually I tried, honestly, to avoid the nitty-gritty philosophical arguments about truth.
So we already seen in, oh yeah, any question? Yeah, sure.
There always seems to be like this trade between a more holistic notions of truth, like Husserl, for example, or phenomenological notions, and more notions of truth that are based on, for example, coherence, where you can't really evaluate something's truth conditions if you don't have a much more robust system of evaluation. Now, one thing that analytic philosophers often have for them is this much more well-defined notion of truthfulness. So how do, like, for example, let's say more continental philosophers or more Husserlian, for example, deal with that? Like what can they say to defend their position against the fact that, well, a lot of the times they are not as well defined with their notion of truth, or it's not as evaluative compared to more analytic positions about truth?
So just to clarify your question a bit more, are you pushing back on the idea that truth is a property of statements and saying that there are some truths that are not expressible in language, perhaps, or?
It's more like for us to be able to have more holistic approaches to truth that are less less logical, positivistic, or something like that. We would need some way to evaluate what truth is in these kind of settings, right? And it seems like a difficult question because I have not seen, like at least I haven't seen a good position about that in more continental schools.
I think it's important, you make an important point that truth is a normative concept, so there's a value-ladenness to that concept. We think truth is something to be aimed for, so something that we should seek in both in our personal lives, but also in doing science. And yeah, I thought you mentioned at one point truthfulness as contrasted with truth. And I think that's an important distinction as well. So when we think about our social relationships, then truthfulness is something that we value in our friends, for instance.
Right. So I really like that notion of truthfulness. But I think we can only use it in very specific contexts. So as Julian said, we could say of a person that she or they are truthful, meaning they have a love for truth. They aim for it or will speak it. But to me, it doesn't make sense to say, well, the statement that 2 + 2 = 4 is truthful. I can see that it's meaningful to say it's true, but to say that it's truthful, so what I'm veering towards is saying, truthfulness is a property of persons and perhaps of groups of agents, much more than truth, which is a property of statements, of theories. And now I should add a bit in response to the claim that there must be persons if there are to be truths. So I'm really on the Platonic end of things. So the philosopher, the 19th century philosopher and mathematician Gottlob Frege, he developed the idea of Gedanken. So if you're a philosopher, you know that. And so he said, those Gedanken aren't actually things that are going on in the head. they are at best some things. There are things somewhere in the Platonic realm that we can have some form of access to through thinking. So that's why I still think it's very important to make a distinction between truth as a property of those Gedanken, and what we are trying to, and what we must do in order to figure out whether a Gedanke is true or not. And I think what you are actually saying is, and all the examples you gave were well, how do we know that this is true, or do we have solid definitions of the statements, of the concepts that function in those statements? But that's all. I all take that on board, but still say there's a distinction between truth conditions and knowledge conditions.
Michiel, do you want to follow up?
Maybe very briefly. So I think when we're talking about like axioms, identical, like logical, even maybe mathematical statements, this might be really somewhat peculiar. I remember a logician, Ollongren from the University of Leiden, who tried to develop a set of statements that should be sent in one of the Apollo rockets. Maybe you know that there used to be also this golden disc with a part of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, etc. And Ollongren and his team thought, like, what can we develop a kind of a language which builds up gradually, which starts with a very simple, like, logical identity statement, like X is X, which for any civilization using whatever kind of language, they will be able to understand, hey, this is a kind of an identity statement. And maybe if we start with this very simple statement, we can add a next statement, like X is not Y. Then they have the same notion of identity and negation, so non-identity. So the idea was maybe we can develop a set of statements that are self-informing, so people can understand, and then gradually we can transfer to this extraterrestrial civilization a set of statements that they gradually learn how we as humans are using language. And I think that's really interesting, but I think these very simple identity statements are indeed maybe a realm of themselves and are not really about the kind of truth that when we talk about coherence theory of truth, which are more about like observation statements, etc., than these very specific sets of statements.
So I want to bring it back to science and humanities and think about well, what does truth mean in the context of these different forms of knowledge, let's say. One way to think about what is distinctive of the natural sciences is that they are mathematical. So the kinds of truths that they give us knowledge of are coming through methods which are quantitative, mathematical, often involving modeling these days, so computational modeling is central. Whereas the humanities, if it offers us truths, they're not something that we can access through constructing mathematical models. So that would give us again a way of dividing between humanities and the sciences in terms of the kinds of truths that they give us access to. But again, notice that way of carving things up is introducing a divide between what can be described mathematically, modeled mathematically, and what cannot. What somehow stands outside of that, pointing to a limit in some sense in terms of what the natural sciences can give us knowledge of. So thinking about mathematics as a method quantitative methods, modeling methods. We can think, well, they give us some unproblematic access to laws of nature, because laws of nature are mathematical. And that would be a kind of Platonic view again. Or you can think, no, these are techniques that are used by scientists as human beings in laboratory situations using technologies often. So there's a kind of entanglement of science and technology. And the kinds of truths that science gives us access to are ones that are constructed through our scientific method, through the kinds of workshops that we build for ourselves as scientists. And so, no, I think these are live questions, ones which we need to reflect on. And once we start to reflect on, well, what are we doing as scientists, then I think we've already stepped over that boundary between the humanities and the sciences. So as soon as science becomes reflective on what it's doing, on its practices, then we start to see that there are all kinds of questions, often epistemic questions actually, that are already operative in science, but perhaps not reflected on. And that provides us with a window to see, well, how to make sense of what we do in science, we actually need to start grappling with philosophical questions. So we step over that boundary from science into the domain of the humanities.
May I respond a bit? Yeah, so a quick response. So what Julian says, I think that's really correct. So in the natural sciences, we work with models. And models leave out things. Models are abstract objects. So that might mean that many scientific statements are not in a strict sense true. They may be very helpful. They may be relevant in policy making, but they may not, in a very strict sense, be true.
Yeah, I think we can go on to the next quote, because I think it's quite relevant within the discourse that we're having, which is, who decreed the science must be able to answer all questions about reality, if what we can say of the word depends on our experience of the word, to describe what lies beyond any possibility of experiential confirmation belongs to the realm of gods, not people. So I think it's interesting also to go back to the metaphor that you established before as conceiving different disciplines as languages and trying to have like ways of explaining the word. But doesn't that also create some hierarchies in the ways that maybe one language is easier to access than another one? And by that, creating maybe this phenomenon of like scientism, where science seems to be more suitable to explain anything in the word, but it then eventually becomes just very reducing things to that single interpretation. So how do you feel about that? And also, how do you think these kind of relate to, for example, certain realms like education, medical settings, where just one point of view is used, forgetting about other ways of seeing?
That's another can of worms we're opening up here. And given three philosophers here, we can talk for that for the rest of the week about that, but I'll try to be short. So I think picking up on where Julian and René talked about, that in the natural sciences and to a lesser extent in the life sciences like biology, etc., the immense benefit of having a shared language, the language of mathematics, is really very helpful in communication, in education, in developing, in working on shared problems and maybe picking up where our predecessors have left. And so the notion, as Galileo said, that somehow mathematics may be the language of nature, or I think, wasn't it Stephen Hawking who said, well, in a way, opening the skull of God allows us then to see that he thought in mathematical language. And that, of course, is something that we don't have like in the arts or in the humanities, where it's the problem yielded by the fact that we use natural language, the language we're using now. And we are translating because I think for the two of us, English is not a native language, maybe for many of you not. So the associations and the meanings of the words might be different from person to person. On the other hand, I think that we shouldn't forget that there's also a kind of a similarity. If we take, for instance, a similarity, I mean, in the sense of that we need a kind of imagination and creativity, as also your first quote alluded to. For instance, when Galileo and Huygens worked on gravity issues, or the famous pendulum analogy, what they did was, in a way, abstract away from many properties. So the material of the pendulum, the color of the pendulum, etc., that was all abstracted away. The fact that the pendulum had a kind of an axe and it was, and there's friction there, and that the pendulum itself has weight, all idealized, so thought of as being zero. So to some extent, what a novel writer is doing, or a Shakespeare when writing Hamlet and really focusing on the killing of the father of Hamlet, leaving out many other maybe political and economical issues, is also a kind of an abstraction. And other authors have written their versions of Hamlet. So to some extent, a kind of a similar building up on each other's work is happening in the arts and the humanities as in the sciences. However, as maybe as novel readers or moviegoers know, the divergence between artists and writers and humanities scholars is much more than in the sciences, which is really partly due to the fact that mathematical language allows us to have really complete consensus on what the precise meaning of statements are, and the statements as representations of reality.
Thanks, this is also interesting. So when it comes to scientism, so the claim that only science can give us knowledge. So if you only think about this for a minute, then it must strike you as being false. So I know here's a hand, and I know here's another hand. Well, do I know this by anything that qualifies as scientific research or scientific investigation? I know that I exist. Did I do any experiments in order to figure out that I existed? No. Do I therefore not know it? Well, that would mean to take leave of the very notion of knowledge. It would reduce us to being totally ignorant persons, which we are not. Here's another thing. I know, and I think all of us know, that once we have made a promise, we thereby have incurred the obligation to do as we have promised. Well, is mathematics going to tell us that? Do biologists tell us that we should keep our promises? Where should we go if we want to figure out whether that's indeed correct? Whether or not, if we made a promise, we should do as we have promised, that we have incurred that obligation. Well, science is nowhere here. And so there are many, many things that we think are morally relevant, that suppose we believe that all human beings are created equal. Well, which scientific theory is going to tell us that? So science is powerful, it's really important. So I want to make very clear that I'm not at all a science skeptic, but I am someone, I do believe that science has a specific office. It has made a very peculiar contribution to our cognitive lives. But there are other sources of knowledge, as I say, and one of them is our moral, so I think we human beings have a moral faculty. And it's through the workings of our moral faculty that we know that lying is wrong, that stealing is wrong, that killing is wrong, but also that some things are really good. We know that having certain features as human beings, you know, being dependable, being loving, being kind, that those are moral virtues. Well, again, the biologists are not going to tell us that, and my mathematical friends are not going to tell me that. Still, we know it. So we should be very clear about the specific, hugely important contribution to our cognitive lives that the sciences are able to give us. But there are other sources and other modes of, you know, getting our hands on truth and getting acquainted with truth apart from science. And to close off this, so I once invited an American philosopher of the name Alex Rosenberg, and he wrote a book on scientism. And in that, and it's all in defense of scientism. So an entailment of his view of scientism is that he does not exist. So he doesn't believe that he exists. And also he doesn't believe that thoughts exist. Because there are no physical theories that tell us about thoughts. There are physical theories that tell us about brain processes, but not about thoughts. And so I had the very curious privilege to introduce Alex by saying, here's a philosopher who doesn't believe he exists and doesn't believe he has thoughts. But we're going to listen to him anyway.
Yeah, so I want to agree in the pushback against scientism, but take a bit of a different angle. So first of all, I think the way that René was arguing was setting up, again, this same divide between facts and values. So going back to Hume, there's been this distinction that's been made between the is and the oughts. So we think that maybe science is concerned with how things are, so it's concerned with the facts, and the humanities are concerned with values, questions about meaning and value and so on. And I think there's already a duality that's been introduced there, which I think is problematic between facts and values. So when we think about science, we might think, well, it's purely objective, it's giving us access to the facts, where those facts are mind independent, so they're real in the sense that they don't depend on us as human beings at all and our experiences of them. Whereas when it comes to values, we're working within the domain of human reality. So we've got this now divide where we think, well, science is always dealing with something that the scientific method is purely objective, it doesn't involve any values at all. So I think we should push back on that and ask ourselves whether that's correct or not. So in the domain that I work of artificial intelligence, for instance, is it the case that in computational fields where you are dealing with technologies, there are no values at work at all? So when we're thinking about artificial intelligence and we're using that in science, is it a case now that science is operating in this purely objective way? Or is there a kind of entanglement of science and technology that we're seeing here, where artificial intelligence is part of the economy, it's part of our politics now, it's part of our society. So there's this way in which science and society are entangled with each other. And I think that should give us pause for thought when we think, well, science is just this objective method that we employ for gaining access to the facts. And think about how science, politics, technology are all kind of interwoven, intermixed in the way that science operates now. So that's one thing I want to say. And then going back to this idea of mathematics as the language in which science is written, I think we need to be aware that what we're dealing with there is a kind of abstraction or idealization often. So what is being idealized away from is human lived experience. So that's already been left out of the picture as long as we're operating with mathematical abstractions that science deals with. So again, think about computational models as they're used for understanding how the brain works, how the mind works. Well, what you get from a computational model is an abstraction, an idealization. And you might say, well, the mind, the brain, it really is a computer. It literally is a computer. So what we're modeling when we make neural network models, for instance, is a model of the mind, because the mind is a computer. And I think there's a mistake that's been made there, actually, of confusing our maps, our models, for the territory, for the system that we're trying to map, for the target system that we're trying to understand. Because I don't think the mind is a computer. Computers are very useful for modeling the mind, but once we make that move of saying, no, the mind is a computer, or the brain is a computer, then we've made that switch from what we are able to construct as an abstraction within our technologies that artificial intelligence gives us, and made the shift to saying, no, the system that we're studying is itself computational. And there's a kind of slide in our reasoning that's happened there. Whereas I think we need to keep apart the model, the map, from the territory or from the target that we're modeling. Once we have that separation made, then we see that what science is often giving us are abstractions and idealizations. And they're doing that in a way that's often value-laden because of the methods that science are employing. They're bound up with society and with politics. And so there are a lot of assumptions that are in play there that I think we need to push back on and be critical on.
May I give one short pushback on what you said? Sure. So you heard me say that I was reviving the old distinction between facts and values when I said that scientism is a wrong view. So what I was not trying to do was to revive that old distinction. What I was trying to do is say there are multiple sources of knowledge. Science is one source of knowledge, but there are many other sources of knowledge. For instance, I mentioned our moral sense. So you know the British moral sense philosophy, tradition in philosophy. So the idea is we somehow are constructed in such a way that we do have the possibility to see moral properties. That was not to deny that there are no value-laden decisions made in scientific research, or that scientific research is isolated from all sorts of value-laden policy decisions that have to be made. That wasn't, so I wasn't reviving that distinction. That was my remark. Yeah.
I think to some extent it seems that there's kind of an agreement between what we are talking about here, about the fact that in science, even though maybe the mathematical language and the output of computational models, etc., may suggest a kind of a neutral and objective representation of reality. And I think what we seem to agree upon is that before we can have any computer, or if it is a human or artificial computer, do computations on reality, we need to model that reality in such a way that it can be represented in mathematical statements, or in algorithms, or in binary algorithms. And there are these processes that several of us talked about of idealization and abstraction that are involved in that. So I think to that extent, all those studying physics, mathematics, or any other, of course, mathematical methods are also being used in the social sciences, behavioral sciences. So at least they all should have the knowledge and the understanding of what it means, what we need to do to any object out there to make it calculable, to make it representable in algorithms, etc., etc. Abstraction, idealization, and there are often more processes involved before we can force parts of reality into these models.
I'm also thinking about the repercussion that such kind of mental frameworks could have on people and the way they reason, the fact that they might kind of hyperfixate on one way of conceiving the word that could also exclude insightfulness to the point of completely denying the existence of thoughts. Do you see any repercussion that, especially given your research with mental health of these kind of phenomenon, do you think that, that could relate?
I can start for sure, yeah. So one of the things that's important in psychiatry is to have in view the lived experience of people. We're dealing with people who are suffering and who want to reduce their suffering as psychiatrists, as psychotherapists who are working with people who are struggling with life. And what happens in psychiatry often is that we use these scales to measure the behaviors of our patients. So we then reduce their problems in life to a set of symptoms that they have that can be given a quantitative measure. And what gets lost in the process is the experience of suffering of someone and the history in their life that's led to them suffering. And we think, well, the way to treat them, the way to cure them is to give them some pharmacological interventions, for instance, which is mostly what happens in psychiatry. And then we're going to try to measure again what effects that intervention has on their experience, but their experience reduced to the set of symptoms that we use to diagnose them. And so there's a lot that's going wrong there, I think, already, in that we think someone's experience can be quantified in this way, and we think that the way to help them, the way to relate to them as a patient is in terms of the scales that we use to measure their symptoms. So what's been lost in that process, I think, is the humanity of the doctor-patient relationship, that this is a relationship between people where one of those persons is suffering and has come to you for you to help them. And so I think that answers your question, right, of what can go wrong in this process of idealization and abstraction. Yeah. That we can start to take something that's very human and experiential, and then by looking at it through the lens of what can be quantified and what can be mathematically modeled, we end up losing the humanity of the person that we're dealing with. And I think that's something really important that we need to recover in medicine and in psychiatry. And that's why I think psychotherapy is valuable. Psychotherapy does give you a way of helping people with their problems in life where there's a recognition that you're dealing with another human being who has a rich life history that has led them to the point of not being able to cope and seeking out your help and so on.
Right, maybe if I can pick up on that, in addition to the criticism that Julian just mentioned, I think there's another dimension that is often left out of the equation when it comes to psychiatric diagnosis, which is really the context, the social context. So often, like diagnosis in the DSM, this manual, is often like it's a disorder once people are no longer suffering from a particular condition that really disrupts their social, professional life. Now, this is not just a matter of that particular individual, but also of the social and professional environment. Take, for instance, a condition like autism. Here at our department, here at the Department of Science, we developed several instruments that help staff and students who are coping with autism to continue working and studying here. It means that as a context, as a small community, we want them to flourish just like everyone else, but we know that maybe some social situations are more difficult for them to work or study in, whereas we know that in other situations, the talents of these people to really concentrate on particular projects or programming projects, for instance, are much better than for many others who are easily distracted by social stimuli, etc. So instead of using a biomedical model, which often thinks about the disorder as a deficit. So someone with autism is worse in processing social and emotional information, for instance. The plea from a neurodiversity perspective is consider all these different types just as being different, and they require also from the social environment a flexibility to negotiate, to handle these, and then we can use the different talents that all these different profiles may bring, including some weaknesses that we also have. So for instance, for someone I talked to recently in a workshop on neurodiversity, he said, well, for an autistic person, it's really difficult, much more difficult to lie than from the neurotypical person. So, and we know from psychological and sociological studies that the average person lies about between 6 and 10 times a day. How is my hair? Oh, it looks beautiful, even though, you know, it's a little bit roughy, etc. So who's normal here? The people like many of us who are lying again and again and again, or the people that are not lying and want to really stick to what they observe as truthful. So I think we really need to be aware of how, as a context, as a community, we contribute to the diagnosis of someone being in a disordered condition or not.
So what I'd like to say is on the topic of idealization and abstraction. So we should never forget that those idealizations are idealizations and that those abstractions are abstractions. And we should never forget that abstractions make certain things visible, but also make certain other things invisible. So Michiel gave the example that in Galilei, when he made the experiments, it was being abstracted from the color of the object. It was being abstracted of ownership of the object. It was abstracted the material the objects were made of. So there were so many abstractions. But of course, in real life, these things are very important. So what's happening? Or here's the great challenge when we do abstraction, when we make abstractions and generalizations, that we don't absolutize them. And I think also what Julian said, you know, we shouldn't absolutize those things that we find in very specific circumstances. And also, you know, we zoom in on one individual person and abstract from the social relationships that we are in. So at the same time, we should say, well, those abstractions, they make certain things visible that otherwise would have remained invisible. So you gain some, you lose some. There is so without those abstractions, Newton's law would never have been discovered. But if we only say, you know, there's only these abstractions, then we lose out on all the concrete, specific, particular things, you know, things having colors, things being made of particular matters, materials, things being owned by particular persons, and so forth. So that's my idea. Abstractions make visible, but at the same time make invisible. What's important is to keep that in mind all the time.
Yeah, after that, I would love to maybe ask you what kind of, yeah. Oh yeah, what kind of solution you would think of. But before that, I would love to, like, anybody can ask question right now and just give you like some time to think about anything. Yeah.
Hi, I'm doing quite a bit of interdisciplinary research myself, and I think the problem that I've come across in a practical sense, and I wondered what you thought about it, was that it leads to over-abstraction a lot of the time, because you can't possibly be an expert in both fields. And when you're working with people who speak a completely different language than you, I feel like both sides tend to oversimplify. And I wonder how you think this should be dealt with, because I do think you still want to do research that's of good quality, but that becomes increasingly difficult if you're combining 2, 3, or 4 different fields at a time.
Well, I can only agree with that observation. So it is difficult, it is challenging indeed if you're bringing 2 different forms of expertise, different, let's say, languages, terminologies, definitions. But at the same time, of course, it's hugely interesting and important, because if you think of something like a psychiatric condition, climate change, etc., these are multi-causal processes or phenomena, and each discipline focuses, while abstracting from others, on specific sets of causal factors. Social scientists are interested in power relations, etc., etc. Epidemiologists are interested in how viruses transmit through a population, etc. But of course, at some point, the two bring together the knowledge that are really relevant. Think of Corona. We know that social connections have really contributed to the spread of the coronavirus in youngsters having parties in parks, etc., even though isolation policies were at stake, etc. So when the government installed this Corona crisis management team without social scientists, they abstracted away from all behavioral and social factors, believing that they could fight a virus epidemic just by focusing on the medical dimensions. We know now it didn't work, it didn't help, and it created perhaps many societal and psychological problems in youngsters and students, etc. So I think what together, if you bring the different perspectives of different disciplines together, is really trying to together describe what is actually the problem or the phenomenon that we are looking at. What causal factors do the different disciplines bring along or can focus upon, and how do we believe that they intersect? How do they dynamically intersect? So we know, for instance, patient compliance is really important in medical treatment. If patients find a particular therapy of taking, as in the early AIDS epidemic, medication was requiring patients to take many pills every 2 hours continuously, so even during the night. A medical optimal therapy didn't work out well because people wanted to sleep. So after a couple of trials and error periods, the preferred therapy was maybe medically less optimal, but since people could actually take the pills every 4 hours or so, the outcome was more positive than the medically preferred therapy. And I think that is something that really bringing the two different perspectives together can yield as an insight that just by singling out these disciplines it can't do. So I think together working on a problem and learning the set of theories and notions that is relevant to a particular phenomenon, like a spreading of corona or a particular element of the climate change problem, that might help then the interdisciplinary project go ahead.
So I think that's it's a nice model that you sketch for how interdisciplinary research could work, but in practice things are more difficult, aren't they, because of each discipline having its own language. There's always problems of translation that arise once we try to bring these different perspectives together. And there are also power dynamics in play, in that there is a privileging in the conversation of certain disciplines and institutionally, but so as much as I'm an admirer of those perspectivism, different perspectives giving us a plurality of different ways of knowing, I think the reality is much more difficult. And one thing I want to stress is the importance of being an expert within your own particular discipline. So as much as I value interdisciplinary work and I pursue it myself, I'm still at the end of the day an expert in philosophy. That's what I was trained in, and so that's the discipline that I always come back to. And I use the methods of my discipline, which are informed by the history of my discipline and by conceptual analysis, for instance, by theory construction, framework building. These are all things that I know that I can do as a philosopher. So when it comes to bringing that to bear in interdisciplinary conversations, I'm always coming at the conversation from what I know best as a philosopher. And then I can contribute something to the discussion because I have an expertise in my own discipline. And so interdisciplinary work definitely to be encouraged, but do it from a discipline as part of a team where you're collaborating with other interdisciplinary researchers. Is the right way to think about it in causal? Not sure. I think that already presupposes that when we're thinking about systemic problems within complex systems, the way to think about that is in terms of a bunch of different interacting causal factors. And again, I think what you get out of that is a kind of idealization or abstraction quite often. Because as soon as you try to understand how the different causal factors interact, you try to identify what the different causes are within a complex system. Inevitably, there's going to be some kind of abstraction necessary there. And at the back of that, I think, is an idea, well, systems are basically sets of interacting causes. So as a philosopher, I want to say, well, is that really what a system is? And then we get into notions like emergence, complexity, that we were talked about in the last BètaBreak, actually, when we were thinking about consciousness. So there, I think, it's necessary to look at your metaphysical assumptions. And one of the assumptions that's in play, if we think, well, a complex system is just a bunch of interacting causes, is a kind of mechanistic picture. And as a philosopher, well, I think we ought to be aware that we're making that assumption, first of all, and then think about, well, are there other ways to think about what systems are once we start to think about positive feedback, negative feedback loops? Are we still dealing with a mechanism? Are we dealing with something that needs to be understood in a different way? So notice that now we've switched over to thinking about philosophy again.
Just very, very briefly, maybe to continue the conversation. I think I agree with Julian that this is often hard work and difficult. And I think for that reason, what you can see in interdisciplinary collaborations is that people often work together on a particular problem or a particular field. So it often makes no sense to say, well, there are these disciplines working together. No, they're working, or disciplinarian scholars or researchers are working together on a specific problem, because that allows you to learn the language from each other on that particular phenomenon, on that particular problem. And then an interesting example that springs to mind is that at the origin of cognitive science and in the late 50s, early 60s, anthropology was still part of the mix, together with philosophy, neuroscience, linguistics, psychology, computation science. Then anthropology got out of fashion. So it was dropped off the roster of what is being done in cognitive science for a long time. And fortunately, the last 10, 15 years, anthropology is back in the field of cognitive science, of cognitive neuroscience. Why? Because it was found that what came out of a Western laboratory or imaging studies or other observations, it didn't hold up across the globe. The assumption was that the findings on perception, for instance, visual perception, would be valid for all of humanity. And then it turns out that, for instance, linguistic differences or other like symbolic differences play out in how we perceive reality, how we can categorize colors. But again, this is really in a particular field, so there are now interesting research centers where anthropologists are working alongside with cognitive scientists, neuroscientists on specific problems. And that's where I think inter and transdisciplinarity, which is a somewhat related kind of working together, is really very valuable and useful.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if anyone wants to ask. Yes? And of course, if you have more questions after, I believe our speakers will be happy to keep talking to you. So.
Yeah, you were talking a lot about abstraction and in science and especially mathematics. And I was wondering, like, what is your view on the abstraction that we do as well in philosophy and social sciences and humanities, by the pure way we reason and we think about things, we abstracting reality and concepts like morals, ownership, and all of these other things. These are just abstract concepts that we deal with, and in science and mathematics it might be the physical property of the pendulum just waving around and the color is irrelevant. So there's abstraction inherently in both of these disciplines, and I was wondering, what is the difference? Is there a difference? And why do we make it so prominent that there's a difference of abstraction?
So there was music behind my head, so I haven't heard probably all your words, but if correct me if I'm wrong, I asking, do the process of extraction and idealization also play a role in the humanities? And do they play that role in a different way than they do in the sciences?
Yes, that, and is that an inherent trait of human nature to abstract, and why do we categorize abstraction in sciences differently than we categorize abstraction in philosophy or humanities?
Yeah, so I do think surely that in the humanities and in the social sciences there are lots of abstractions going on as well. So for instance, there is such a thing as power relationships that obtain among human beings. Now, you might think that it's a very generic phenomenon that's going on throughout all human relationships. On the other hand, when you have no eye for the many subtle distinctions between, well, the relationship between a medical doctor and their patients, or between a parent and their children, between a teacher and the pupils, between a professor and the students, so if it's all, you say, well, so there are all power relations. Well, sure, there is something of that, but there are so many qualifications you need in order to get to the reality of them. So it might still be very worthwhile to make a very general statement about power relationships. On the other hand, so they make something visible. That abstraction makes something visible, but it also tends to blur or make invisible certain other aspects of the very same sort of relation. A second thought is, so why do we make these categorizations, and why do we subsume phenomena under these general categories? I think very often that has a very pragmatic reason. It serves our purpose when we make a distinction between things that are edible and non-edible, or poisonous and edible, or things that keep us healthy and not. So that is a very pragmatic reason for applying those very general categories. But I may have missed out. Actually, I know I've missed out on certain other things that were in your question. But Julian perhaps has better ears than I have.
So I heard you saying, well, you philosophers, you're always making abstractions in building your systems. You're dealing with concepts. Those are abstractions. You weren't being quite as critical as that, but so
I studied philosophy myself as well,
yeah.
so I have background.
And that's right. It's a highly abstract discipline, and we've probably been noticing that in the discussion today, that René is very good at coming up with examples and keeping things concrete. But often we've been dealing with very abstract notions, like starting off thinking about what truth is, and you don't get more abstract than that. I think what I want to say in response is, well, in my work, we try to do a lot of studying of practices, which means like looking at the particularities of what happens in particular situations and how people respond to them. And so we do ethnographic observations, and what's distinctive about an ethnographic method is you're making observations while participating in a practice, in a situation, and you're concerned with exactly the details of what happens. And I think that as much as philosophers do like to look at things from a high level and deal with how things hang together overall in the most general, universal way, we can also be very interested in the details of what happens in particular situations. And so I think it really depends on the philosophical approach. And I think one of the things that happens in literature, for instance, if we think about the humanities and literature as a field of the humanities, is a concern with the fine-grained details of how people live, for instance, and their relationships, and that's part of what we're concerned with in storytelling. And so perhaps you put your finger on on a key difference between the science and the humanities, that the humanities does offer methods for not just dealing with these universal abstract truths, but also looking at the fine details of what happens in everyday life.
Right. I think to some extent you're right, that philosophers are dealing with abstractions and are singling out particular objects, but the reverse is also true. Starting from at least Aristotle, philosophers have also applied a kind of an encyclopedic perspective, showing how particular concepts, for instance, are related to each other. Even like Plato, Aristotle started to show how definitions are building upon each other. And while listening also to René and Julian's answers, I was thinking about two philosophers / science and technology studies experts, Bruno Latour and Harry Collins, who somehow at the same time, maybe now 20 years ago, wrote articles against climate skepticism. And their argument was like, we as philosophers, we studied, so Harry Collins studied gravitational wave research, showing that there's not only mathematics involved in these, but there are also, like, when do we consider a particular finding statistically significant? Well, then the top professor holding in the grants may have a somewhat bigger say than the master student just doing an internship there. Where are we going to publish? So how are results presented? Bruno Latour has done similar work, like the anthropology in the lab. But Harry Collins and Bruno Latour wrote very critical articles because they found their work being used by climate skeptics, saying, well, we just don't know, so we don't need climate policy because the science is uncertain, or there are power relations, as René also pointed out, at stake. And both Collins and Latour said, no, this is not what we meant. We showed that indeed also human and power relations, etc., and perceptual weaknesses, etc., play a role, but we meant this just to make people aware, the scholars, the researchers aware, so they can improve their science and they can be aware of these power relations, because we believe that indeed it can help to make the models even better if we are doing away with the power stuff. So I think it's not just the abstraction, but it's also in some sense the complexification, if that's a word, that philosophers do.
Okay, I think we're going to be able to conclude the conversation on this point. It was definitely wonderful for us being on stage here asking you the question. I hope you also got something out of this, and if you have even more questions, might be a good indicator. Otherwise, you can also continue maybe asking if their speakers are available after this. We just have to clean up the stage. And one little last highlight that I would like to present to you, like a very fortunate coincidence, is the fact that Dr. Woudenber is going to publish a book in May, a collaboration with another philosopher that is going to tackle a very similar topic, especially the title is A Philosophy of the Humanities, which interrogates the contribution of the humanities to knowledge and how also the different disciplines within the humanities also talk to each other. I hope I'm expressing well. If you want to say something more specific, you can definitely do that right now. Yeah.
So my pitch for the book is this. In philosophical circles, there is a well-designed field of investigation called philosophy of science, and Michiel is one exponent or a representative of that. And we've been asking, why isn't there such a field as philosophy of the humanities? And so we thought, it might be a cool project to carve out some parameters within which we might discuss certain philosophical issues that are generic to the humanities. And so one of the things that I said about these three properties, and to which Julian objected that we were thereby saying that the natural world is shorn of intentionality, value, and meaning. So we addressed that problem extensively. And my last word on this would be, so at the moment at the University of Amsterdam there is the Spinoza lecturer, Amitav Ghosh. And so he wrote this actually shocking book, the curse of the nutmeg's curse, or the curse of the nutmeg. And we discussed that in the book also, because we are definitely against the idea, as you mentioned it, that the natural world is shorn of meaning and of value, and perhaps even of intentionality. We reject that view. So that obviously means some philosophical footwork that we are doing in the book. But that was the pitch for the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And our last little thing. Yeah, sure. Okay, sure.
So I want to promote this book, The Blind Spot, which was kind of the inspiration for our session today. So after the consciousness session, we had a chat about this book and thought it would be interesting to use it as a basis for a BètaBreak. So I recommend it to everybody. It's by two physicists, Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser, and a philosopher, Evan Thompson. And it covers a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. So check it out.
Okay, and now our last thing is we want to introduce our BètaBreak event for April. So we hope to all see you there on April 9th to talk about innovation and society and how it can be analyzed from different perspectives. So the discussion will stem from the movie Metropolis. I don't know if you know it, but it came out about 100 years ago. And from there, we'll talk about the analysis of technology and the implications or opportunities of our dependence on it. So today, we talk a lot about whether machines and innovation are really doing more harm than good to our society. So hopefully in this edition, we will be able to tackle that. So we hope to see you all April 9th. Thank you all for staying this far, and thank you so much to our speakers. We hope you had a wonderful time. Thank you.